Great. So now that we've covered some of the server components, let's talk about the clients. Now, I will say the word client is kind of confusing or a misnomer in PaperCut sometimes. There are a lot of clients and it can get confusing, and we even have a client called the user client that we'll cover a little bit later on that now that we have other clients that are used by users, it can be confusing, but I think at the end of the day, we're defining that as just anything running on the end user's machine that's dependent on a server component, and that is, crucial to some feature or function. Okay, great. So let's start with the direct print monitor, which again, if you remember from one of the first videos, is also a print provider. So the print provider being that thing that tracks the jobs, the direct print monitor is honestly just a scaled down version of the secondary server. And so some of the use cases, and a lot of this is more of a review, but USB printers and printers that are configured direct IP or direct to the host name. Now, in general, it has a simple job in life, pretty much identical to a secondary server. It analyzes jobs when they come in, it can apply watermarks, it does job modification, and also it can print PDFs with certain features. Nothing new here between this and a secondary server, just a little bit more lightweight as an installer and a little bit better designed for a desktop. Okay, great. So when it comes to direct printing, there is one challenge. Everything sounds great. Oh yeah, we can track direct printing, but there's one challenge that you may have encountered at some point, and that's if you have a bunch of users who all have a direct IP printer pointed to a physical device, and they all have their own print queues, so there's no print server, there's no central place to track. The answer is, well, yeah, we'll just install the direct print monitor on all of those end users' computers. But when you do that, each of those print queues, even though they're all going back to a unified central printer, they all represent basically a different object to PaperCut. So we don't know that that's a different printer. We just, in the database, we see it as a completely different printer, even though it's the exact same device. And so what that creates is duplicates, creates a lot of entries, and let's just say you had 100 physical printers and everybody's direct IP printing. Multiply that by your number of users, and that's how many print objects you could potentially have. That's a lot. So we added a feature to the direct print monitor that links print queues. Basically, we look at the IP address, the host name. We try to say, are these actually the same printer on the other end of these print queues? Let's consolidate those. And that's where you'll see that there's this numbers here that actually are next to the print object names, and that kind of represents how many printers are rolled up under that one object. So what does that mean? At the end of the day, it means way simpler to manage some of the price modeling and some of the other filters and restrictions and the behavior that you want to occur for that physical printer, which is represented across multiple machines. So if you want to look in the config properties file, the way you can tell whether this is on or not is there's this line in the config file that says direct print mode equals true or false. And if it's true, linking will be in play. You may even notice that this actually shows up on secondary servers as well, but it's off, and we don't recommend turning it on. Cool. So that's direct print monitor. There's not a ton to it. It's a great way to track local printing. And it's really crucial to print deploy. So we're not going to talk about print deploy significantly in this video, but when you do get to print deploy, one of the things that the print deploy client does is it adds the direct print monitor for direct IP printers that it's adding. So if you're deploying direct IP printing instead of print server connections through print deploy, it will actually add the direct print monitor to the machine, which is really cool. So it saves you having to do two separate installs for one core function. Anyway, you'll get more information on that later on in the print deploy session, but yeah, I just thought I'd mention that. So cool. So without direct print monitor, you're kind of blind to any USB printers or any direct IP printers that are taking place or that are configured in the environment. You got your app server running on a print server, for instance, maybe more of a hybrid environment where some people are using a print server and others are not. When you add the direct print monitor, suddenly each of these print providers is talking back to the app server. So they each have a config properties file, and in that text file is a application server IP that you configure. You configure where they should talk or what they should talk to and get their commands from, which should be the app server. So direct print monitors also have a failure mode. So just bear in mind that if something goes wrong, you can keep things going in the event of an outage. Cool. So let's talk a little bit about the end user client, which is actually the user client, the pop-up client. I call it the pop-up client or the messaging client. The whole purpose of the pop-up client or user client, as it shows up in our other parts of our product, is to pop up, is to communicate with the end user, to show them a balance. It's the visual representation of PaperCut, MF or NG, other than print deploy. So when you think about the user client, think whenever you use a user balance and you want to demonstrate to the user how much money they have left for printing. When you want to prop up or authenticate users, you've learned a lot of this in level 1, right? Or when you want to present them with shared accounts, like in a law firm that has matter numbers. All of this is the user client. Now it's pretty important to know, what it can do and what it can't do. So what can it do? It can do a lot of functionalities. It's powerful. It can do print confirmations, etc. But it cannot talk to the site server. So it's very dependent on the application server. It talks with a continuous connection. So it reaches inbound to the app server and says, hey, what should I do? I'm waiting for commands. Now bear in mind the actual direct print monitor and the user client don't talk to each other. They don't even know each other exist. They're both talking to the app server. The app server's calling the shots. So job comes into print provider pauses the job, analyzes it, reaches into the app server and says, hey, what do I do with this print job? App server checks and says, you know what? That user is supposed to bill their jobs back to a shared account. Tells the client, hey, pop up and ask the user what shared account the user wants to charge to. So this is all happening kind of through the app server as that intermediary, right? The client says, receives the input from the user. Actually, the user wanted to charge to their personal account, whatever. Goes back to the app server. App server makes the changes, adjusts the balance, etc. Then tells the print provider, okay, go ahead and print. All of that's happening in the background. So the user client is cool because it maintains a connection back to the app server. Again, when it comes to sizing, if you've got hundreds of thousands of these, you really want to think about how you're sizing your environment to accommodate all of those connections back to the app server. So now that you kind of know that a client is reporting in, I think it's important to share that what's being reported by the user client. So first and foremost, it's reporting back the IP address of the machine that it's on. And also, it's presenting the user that's logged into that machine. So these two pieces of information are combined basically to help the app server know not only who it should pop up for, who should the client pop up for, but where that person's at. Because you got all these clients maintaining connections, it needs to be able to differentiate. Okay, which one should I tell to pop up, right? Well, normally that's not a problem, but when you get into certain things like network address translation or NATing, what do you think the impact could be? Well, generally speaking, what happens is the communication as far as the app server sees it is coming from one IP address, but that could be reflecting actually multiple machines behind the NAT. So how do we get around that? So there is actually a capability in PaperCut. There's a config key in the config key editor that allows you to actually match only on username and not on IP. So it's just a workaround, but it's really important for certain situations. One of them is in the event that you have network address translation. So now that we kind of understand that, let's think a little bit about the user client in the context of terminal servers. So if you have a terminal server or you're using Citrix, think about what problems might exist with the way that this client reports in an IP address, reports in a username. How might that be impacted by a Citrix environment? So what I'd love for you to do is to read this article and start to get familiar with all the ways that you can install PaperCut with Citrix, with a terminal services environment, etc., VDI, and also just kind of pay special attention to the client, and a little hint, some of the things we talked about in the last slide will be relevant as well. Another thing I would like you to do, so giving you a lot of homework on this one, is I would love for you to look up TTL values for the user client. So remember, the user client has the ability to prompt users for their credentials, but there's a way that you can actually adjust the TTL, or the time to live, so that the client remembers the user for whatever specified amount of time. And so there's a lot of different values that you can use. But what I'd like you to find out is what happens if you set that key to 0? How long will the user's credentials be remembered? And I also want to throw you another curveball. Maybe look for some other keys that are not as obvious. Maybe, I don't know, a -1, or even maybe a -2. And let me know what you come up with. Anyway, thank you for sitting through some of the architecture discussions. If you do some of this homework right now and you go through some of the documentation combined with the videos, you should be equipped to pass the test, and I wish you the best of luck. Thanks.